Hello and welcome back to Communications 6019, and here in week 4 we're going to take a look at intercultural communications in the workplace. Intercultural communications is important in a general sense, but it is acutely important in the business world because misunderstandings can lead to job losses, financial losses, and at the worst, the reputation of the company. So let's be careful and kind of work our way through some of these ideas. Now, the first one, the first problem that could arise is what's called bypassing. When two people use the same word or phrase, but they mean two different things to those individuals. So when that is the case, we want to make sure that whatever we state in an email or in a conversation, that we're sensitive to the context in which that word is used. We also consider that other person's background, their cultural background, their educational background, and whatever other situations that you think may influence or inform in some way or another the understanding that that person will have of your statement. So if we're careful and we think carefully and clearly about our language, we're going to minimize any kind of issues regarding bypassing. Now, one of the best ways you can get around that is to repeat what the other person has said in your own words. So what you're saying is the following: he said, she said. And when you do that, you are now, in a sense, translating the idea into your own terms, and you're reading or speaking out loud to the other person what you think they have said. If I understand you correctly, you have just said the following. So if you can do that, you can check for understanding, comprehension, and accuracy. And if you can do that, you will be able to communicate well with that other person. Those different words that you're going to use, no matter what they are, still need to inform and influence the key idea that's being presented. So neither person, speaker or listener, or writer and reader, miss out on those key ideas. And of course, if you're still not sure, there's nothing wrong with asking a question for clarification, for sure. So what we're talking about here is the fact that our culture shapes the way we think. Media also shapes the way we think. And so our values, our priorities, our practices, our tendencies, our biases, our prejudices, all kinds of things are shaped by the culture that we live in and grow up in. But we typically don't talk about culture in this way because we don't tend to see it. We live amongst agreed to behaviors and expectations, ways of life, ways of speaking that are what it is that they are implied and they're tacit. In other words, people just intuitively know this is the right way to speak. This is the right word to use in this context. And until it's actually pointed out to us, we don't really think about it. We think about these things as being somehow natural, when in fact they're learned, right? They're learned through school, through work, through our peers, our family. We internalize these ideas and these ways of seeing the world that we really kind of don't think and stop and think about how they influence our thoughts and feelings and behaviors, both to ourselves and to others. So if you wish to minimize bypassing and other issues associated with communicating with people from another part of the world, is if you can understand the way the culture works, you can then turn around and really kind of open yourself up to that global market. And there's a whole range of things that you can do. You can volunteer overseas. You can move to another country temporarily and learn their language. Student exchanges are really good. Many of you are here either in Canada or have learned enough English to be able to come to Fanshawe College. This is exactly what I mean. If you are versed or well-versed enough in a language, you have many more opportunities. And that's really kind of the important thing. So individuals can do things differently, use different words, but no matter what, we have an understanding that is implied in our culture, but we need to be informed about the way things are typically done in the other culture. And that's what intercultural communications is all about. It isn't just worried about what you're saying, but understanding the interpretation in that other culture. That's really what matters. So if we were to try to kind of visualize who we are in our culture and also who we are in our business culture or the organizational culture, we could come up with a diagram that looks very similar to this. So here we are kind of in the center right here. And we are influenced by our national culture, the culture, in this case, from Canada or Ontario, but certainly North America. So that is kind of the culture that is around everyone. Where it starts to change is over here, right? A generational culture. So that is the influence that your own family, both your immediate family and your parents' family, have upon your behavioral traits and your way of being able to speak a language correctly and being aware of some of these cultural differences. So we have us, personal culture. We have our national culture, which is the world that we're from, the country we're from. The generational culture, which is our parents. On the other half, we've got the professional culture here. This is the business or the organizational culture as it exists and functions. How do individuals address our, immediate superiors, our CEOs or middle management people? Is there a hierarchy, right, within that organization to address people in a certain way? Or is it kind of fairly open and horizontal, where although people may be a boss, or they may have people working below them, they're treated as simply, one of many other individuals within that culture. So professional and corporate culture, these two here, have a lot to do with how we interact with others, especially in terms of how we address them, how we speak to them, the particular kind of language that we use. So we as individuals in a corporation still have all these other influences that are working upon us. So along with bypassing, the other way in which you can become more well-versed with intercultural communication is developing what's called cultural competence. And that's the ability to communicate effectively across these cultural differences. At the very least, being aware that these differences in fact exist and being mindful of them. So how do you do that? Well, what you do is become aware, right? There are preferred values and behaviors. They're influenced by the culture of a person you're speaking to, because you have your own culture, the culture of the individual that you're communicating with. And it's not a matter of being right or one being better than the other. They're merely different. That's all there is to it. Cultural differences are just that. They are differences. We shouldn't assign a value judgment and state that somehow one is better than the other. They're merely different. That's it. If you can be flexible and open to change, you'll be just fine. This could be something as simple as not expecting an email to be answered within 3 minutes. First of all, you could be sending an email through a business organization that is on the other side of the world. It's 3 o'clock in the morning over there. How dare you expect an answer within 2 seconds? That's just the way it is. So if you're flexible and open to change and know that you're dealing with someone on the other side of the earth, where it may be nighttime here, but it's daytime there, vice versa, keep that in mind, because then that will at least alleviate any kind of issues that arise from waiting for a response, right? Give the person some time to read it. Being sensitive to verbal and nonverbal behavior. Now, verbal behavior has to do with speaking on the phone or person to person. Nonverbal behavior is also important, especially with face-to-face communication. Not so important with emails and letters because there's no nonverbal behavior. But if you are actually speaking to someone right in front of them, there's both verbal and nonverbal behaviors that will affect the messaging, right? The way your message comes across. So be mindful of how much you move your hands when you speak, or how you move your eyes around. Try to lock into that person and look at them when you're speaking to them. Some cultures prefer that people don't do that. Be aware of that, because it could be actually the height of rudeness to stare at someone, perhaps a member of the opposite sex, to stare at them when you talk to them. Maybe that's not the right thing to do. Or even when you speak to them, to allow some time for people to think about what you've said, formulate an answer, and respond back. Nothing needs to be done one after the other. So different cultures will address these issues in different ways. Now, an awareness of the values and beliefs and practices of these other cultures, also important. And also not only in a general sense, the differences between those cultures, but also the differences of individuals within that culture. A particular culture may say that, not to look at people right in the eye when you speak to them, or if you may wish to look away because that's the way that business is conducted or interaction is conducted. But that person in particular, they may not mind that you look at them. It could be different. So be mindful of these particular changes. And of course, the more you interact with someone, the more likely you are to be able to know these particular changes and these differences. Okay, so when we talk about businesses and the economy, the global economy, exactly that. It is a global economy. This is the kind of communications that you will need to learn to become very well at, to be really efficient in intercultural communication. And that works both ways. That means both from North America to other parts of the world, and also other parts of the world to North America. So the way in which proper communication is done in a business setting is an awareness from both parties that things are done in a certain way. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It really facilitates better communications. If both parties are aware of the respective differences that the other person has, whether we're speaking to them face to face, on the phone, an email or business letter, communication is done in a certain way. And those intercultural differences are really important. Now, one of the ways in which you can learn about a culture is to immerse yourself in it. And that certainly is possible if you're lucky to live there for a period of time and really learn how things are done. If you travel around the world, if you're someone that likes to travel and as a tourist, providing you actually interact with people rather than kind of spend a week in a resort, if you actually do interact with people who are from there, you'll learn pretty quickly not to make assumptions so quickly. Let people act the way they feel most comfortable to learn about these things, because there's nothing wrong with doing that. That's probably the best way to learn, is just sort of being a little bit more quiet, listening a little bit more, and watching. So the last thing we want to do, though, is make false assumptions about that particular culture, things that we think are going on. Because when we're doing that, we're being ethnocentric. And ethnocentrism is a view that our culture is, for whatever reason, better than all the others. And this is typically a North American thing or a Western European thing, or the developed world versus the developing world, or what used to be called first world nations versus third world nations, which is in itself derogatory. So if we're being ethnocentric, we are viewing the rest of the world through these kind of glasses that are just showing us stereotypes. So when we are looking at another world and making value judgments, we're looking at stereotypes. And there is great affront in doing that. If you look at people simply because you think you know them, you're making a huge mistake. You will end up not communicating well. And that's not what you want to do. You want to be able to speak to people as individual people, as individuals who are coming from a certain time and place, a certain culture, and the end result is you can speak to them in a more confident tone. If you don't do that, and you are ethnocentric, you are completely unaware of how uniquely different that person is. And so you start making sort of value judgments and hasty judgments about that other group of people or that individual based on prejudices and biases that, guess what, may come from your own culture or reinforced by your family. Maybe your family, without you realizing, were maybe kind of inherently racist or biased, and all of a sudden one day you realize they have been. But it's not until you've been taken out of your environment, placed in a new one, that you realize, wow, these people are not the way I thought they were. They're completely different. And so that's one way to overcome ethnocentrism, is to be aware that it is happening. The other one, too, is to be aware of what's called a confirmation bias, where you You think you're looking at the other person or that other culture, and you're really kind of blind to the complexity and richness of that culture. Instead, you're simply looking for things to confirm your bias in the first place. Yeah, so they're doing this, or they speak this way, or they act this way. And all you're doing is confirming that racist bias you already have. You don't want to do that. That is absolutely the wrong thing to do. Okay, we, just as every other culture, has or have patterns of behavior that are acceptable there and perhaps are or not acceptable elsewhere. We need to be aware of those in order to be able to think clearly about who these individuals really are. So if we start generalizing about that other group, we are ethnocentric because we're stereotyping. We're not being honest with ourselves and, more importantly, not with the other person. We're stereotyping because we're simply looking to confirm what we think is there, which maybe it is. But let's say you're missing 98% of the other rich and complex other aspects of that person's individuality or their culture that you're not seeing because you're refusing to see it. You're ignoring it. So stereotyping, confirmation bias, all of these things lead to ethnocentric viewpoints. And you don't want to do that because it is at the very least unethical. Now, over time, some of these beliefs and values that come from your own culture or my own culture, these almost are unconscious. And it's not until you interact with someone from another culture that you can see played out right in front of you these opinions that you may have had about someone that are really not based on reality or in reality, but just based on a stereotype, right? A caricature of someone. Now, we have caricatures around the world. Canadians are considered to be fair, that we think that fairness is a good thing, that we should allow, everyone an opportunity, while there are other countries that think that no, certain groups should be treated preferentially because they're members of royalty or because they're wealthy, whatever it may be. So it depends on where you are and how you see the world. So Canadians here also think that competition is a good thing because if people are allowed to compete, then the best person will win. The person with the best product, the best value, the best viewpoint, they're the ones that are going to win. Now we have competition on the one hand, but then we may have cooperation, which is significantly an important part of another culture. So again, we need to be aware that different cultures do things differently. And again, it's not that one is better or worse than the other. They are merely different. Competition on the one hand, cooperation on the other. So these kinds of things are simply what makes a culture unique. In Japan, there's been for many years this idea of group thinking, where the CEO says whatever he or she thinks is on their mind, and the group just follows. They follow blindly. They don't ask questions. This kind of thinking is now in the process of changing in a significant way, because there is now finally the room for people to say, well, I respectfully, I should say, disagree with you. And I think that perhaps, what about doing it something this way? So these are cultural norms, the norms that people in power are listened to and followed unquestionably. So we don't want to be doing this all the time. So even cultures that have had this way of thinking can still change. In Japan, this is in the process of changing. And just imagine, in most Western European countries, there was royalty. There was the idea of kings and queens, and the whole royal family. And right now, there's not very many of them. England and maybe a couple of other ones. So it is possible to change. It is possible to turn around and say, no, fairness is a good thing. And maybe having, a royal family kind of puts them at a complete advantage over everyone else versus, how hard it is for us to live day to day. So cultural norms can change and do change. Okay, these values and beliefs not only can come from cultural acculturation, we'll say, but also religion. Religion in certain cultures has a lot to do with the way people behave towards one another. So Christianity, for example, is looked at as sort of proactive. We go out and do things to make things happen, and that's fine. But other cultures believe that us individuals trying to do that is not maybe blasphemous, but it's bordering on pride and hubris. That somehow, we can have total control over our lives. Our book is written from the day we're born. That's what some cultures believe, while others think that, well, you can change your possibility to a better life, in the afterworld. It really depends. So Christianity thinks that being proactive is a good thing. Some Muslim and Asian countries, the idea of predicting the future is, like I say, bordering on hubris. The Protestant religion believes in a hard work ethic, which will then be, not satisfied, but rewarded with a wonderful afterlife. And again, this is all it all has to do with just work, a work ethic. Work ethic is good. It gets you to a better place. Let's be proactive and take control. Other cultures say, no, we shouldn't do that because it's somehow trying to predict the future, which is not often a good thing. Now, I mentioned before nonverbal communication, which is particularly important in face-to-face communication, because at that point, we need to be mindful of what happens when we're talking to other individuals. So what's important to remember with nonverbal communication is that it is broadcasting the other person information that you may not be aware that you are broadcasting or communicating. So what does this mean? What it means is a nonverbal symbol, whatever that may be, a hand gesture, it communicates above and beyond the words. It could be something really as odd as, let's say you're speaking to someone face to face and you are agreeing with them, but your face is going back and forth like this, like you're saying no. Or you're telling somebody the opposite, that you are disagreeing with them, but your head is nodding up and down and going, no, it's confusing, right? It's contradictory. So nonverbal language is language that is implicitly understood and recognized and read, but it's also language that often we are not ourselves aware that we are broadcasting to others. So we want to be very careful when we do that. So nonverbal communication, especially face-to-face communications, maybe a little bit less so in a phone conversation, but the inflection in our voice, for example, or pauses, pregnant pauses or otherwise, those two will influence unconsciously the way in which someone is receiving your message and interpreting it. So nonverbal communication, it could be our hand gestures, smiles and frowns that we make with our faces. We're doing it all the time as we speak, but we're not often aware of what exactly it's broadcasting to the other person. So we're not conscious. That's just it. We're not conscious that we're doing these things. So we need to be mindful that depending how we speak, sometimes we need to be very conscious of the fact that our hands move around. When I speak, for example, my hands move around a lot. I don't mean to frighten anybody. I get very sort of passionate and kind of into what I'm talking about. And when I do that, my eyes kind of bug out and my hands start to move. The inflection on words start to change. But the message is getting through. And depending on the context in which this is occurring, that could actually be a good thing. If you are sort of striking your fist into your palm and saying, I think this is important, well, that's visually, as much as in words, indicating to the person that you think this is important, right? You're knocking your fist into your other hand. So you're seeing visually that this person really thinks that what they're saying is serious and important and worth hearing. So it can work in your favor, but you also have to be very careful about how you're doing it. So the variety of different things that can happen when you are speaking to someone, there's the open versus the closed or defensive body position. If someone is leaning way back in a chair and talking to you, chances are they're pretty comfortable, as opposed to someone sort of hunched over and kind of defensively covering or protecting their body. Something else is going on in their minds. Now, even if there isn't, the person who is viewing it, not the person doing it, but the person viewing it may mistakenly read into it something that is not there. Because as we are talking about these things, open and closed body positions, sitting quietly or fidgeting, eye contact, face-to-face contact, all these things, although they are broadcasting information, messages that are nonverbal to the other person, we often don't realize that we're doing it, first of all. And secondly, because we're not aware that we're doing it, we're still broadcasting the same message to that other person that you may not even want them to even think about, right? You're not going, I think this is important, as you strike your fist into your palm. You could be fidgeting and talking about something that clearly is making you nervous or anxious, and you can literally see it in your body. So all these things, even if you don't intend to broadcast a message, likely will to the viewer or to the listener. So gestures, the notion of personal space, deliberately touching someone on the shoulder or poking them or something, that's not the right way to speak, because we don't know what message we're broadcasting over and above the words that we're speaking to that other person. So we need to be very careful when we do that. So if we are going to communicate effectively, we need that cultural understanding. We need that awareness that our nonverbal communication matters just as much in our overall message to someone that is seeing it. Again, an email or letter, that's not important. But learning at least a little bit about that culture, and if you're lucky, maybe even the language, will at the very least give you an idea, a glimpse into how they think. Because language is a reflection of consciousness, no matter where you find it. Whatever language you speak, the way in which people think is often built right into their language. How they use it, the words they use, the connotations and denotations of individual words, all of that is going to tell you how they think. Now, if you are somewhere else in another part of the world and you do take the time to learn a few words, at the very least also, you're going to be able to get around and, find out where to buy food and do your laundry and find a hotel and these kinds of things. But certainly, very much so, if you can speak that other language, you will get an advantage over other businesses, other organizations who are trying to secure a deal with someone who lives in China or, who lives in India or, Uganda. It doesn't matter where they're living. If you can speak of the language enough to communicate, well, that likely puts you in a pretty good position to be able to talk one-on-one with someone, to work out some differences. And you kind of cut out the middleman, is what the expression would go, and be able to speak to them directly. That goes a long way. So when you are writing to someone overseas in another part of the world, do be mindful of titles. You can use a title. It may or may not be, there may not be the ability to use first names. I would stick with last names for sure, as much as possible until you know that person well. So titles and last names, not first names. Avoid slang, especially sports metaphors, because we have a lot of sports metaphors in the English language that typically reflect an interest in either hockey or football or basketball. But what if someone that you're communicating with is really well versed in cricket, right? And they're using a sports metaphor that belongs to the world of cricket. You may not have any idea what they're saying. And to them, they know exactly what they're trying to say. So avoid using sports metaphors. Simply use the word. So instead of saying, he stick-handled his way through the situation, you could say, no, this person was really careful and mindful of the situation and achieved the desired results. That's what stick handling is. So avoid those because you don't want to have a misunderstanding. Idioms that can't be translated well. There's all kinds of things, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If you translate that into another language, who knows what that's going to come out sounding like. So, avoid doing that. Write in English as much as possible, unless you are really fluent in that language. And try, first of all, to see if you can do it. But if you can't, leave it in English. Because if you aren't well versed enough in that other language, you may come off sounding really unprofessional, juvenile, or just plain stupid. Right? You don't want to do that. Using familiar terms, right, to agree with someone rather than concur with. Action verbs, to buy something rather than get or obtain. It still means the same thing, but agree and buy are common words, common English words. And like I said, along with sports metaphors, avoid jargon, because jargon does exactly the same thing. At the very least, it will confuse people. You don't want to be doing that. So, organizational interaction and international communication, all of this is based on what I've just talked about. The idea that you can communicate with another individual in another part of the world in an open and equitable and objective kind of way. Have yourself understood if you understand how that other culture does things, thinks about things, and be mindful of that. And if you can, it's one of the best ways to communicate and get the message across without any sort of secondary, influences or intentions, because that's not what you want to do. If you are writing to someone, you can buffer your negative messages, just like you did last week. Buffer reasons, and then or buffer / apology, then reasons, then the bad news, if need be. So, if you are careful in your writing, you will avoid phrases that could be considered demeaning or derogatory or negative. And all of that is going to put you in a better position to communicate effectively. Because remember, if you say something a little bit gauche, right, a little sort of incorrect or mildly incorrect, that's one thing. But to make a mistake in writing, it's going to last forever. It's permanent. It's now been filed away. So be very careful. Think about those emails possibly being looked at a month, 5 months, a year later. Think twice about how you write them. Okay, so that's it for international communication and intercultural communication. And I'll be back very shortly with our next set of slides.